motivated to write this book for two major reasons. The first reason is that we have this wealth of epidemiological research showing that we have widespread inequalities in nutrition in the United States that follow a socioeconomic and a racial ethnic pattern. And we know that these disparities matter because of just how tremendously impactful our diets are on our health. You know, what we eat drives a number of diet-related diseases, from heart disease to certain types of cancers to stroke. And the fact that we have these widespread disparities means that we have one factor that is helping to drive health disparities on a really broad level. But the second motivation for the book was that despite this knowledge of how important and broad these disparities go, our explanations for what is driving these disparities have actually really fallen short. And the one that most people are most familiar with is the food desert argument. And this is an argument related to differences in people's access to healthy food. And the argument basically goes that in some neighborhoods, typically low-income communities of color, there is a dearth of supermarkets, places where you can access fresh produce. And if it's geographically difficult to access fresh foods, then it's also going to be harder to eat healthy. And that is what is causing these dietary differences across race and class. And this is an argument that has gained a lot of traction over the years, but it's actually an argument that has proven to be very limited in explanatory power. And so my motivation for writing the book was, well, if we don't think that food access is actually the primary driver of these inequalities, then what else is going on? And a lot of the work looking at food is really based on very quantitative research. So going in and surveying people or doing public health interventions. And I noticed that there was a lack of work that involved just talking to people and understanding how they made choices about food and understanding how their broader environments shaped the decisions and trade-offs that they had to make around food and dietary choices. And so I wanted to do research that centered people and their experiences. And I wanted to talk to people and I wanted to observe people. And I wanted to use that kind of data to understand how people were making tough dietary decisions. I chose to do my research in the Bay Area, a place that is known for inequality in the US. And while the juxtaposition of affluence and poverty in the Bay Area can seem and is quite extreme, it's also emblematic of what's happening across the country. So I think about the Bay Area as more of a trendsetter than an outlier, because things that have happened in the Bay Area, increasing residential segregation, a hollowing of the middle class, increasing financial hardship among the poor. These are things that we're seeing happening across America and across American cities. So while the families in my research and in my book all lived in the Bay Area, I think that they actually tell a very American story. When I set out on this research, I knew that I wanted to study how families ate, but I didn't know that what I was going to end up studying was how intimately tied food decisions within families are to beliefs about good motherhood, about what it means to feed and to nourish children across society. So in the book, I talk about a term that sociologists use. It's called the ideology of intensive mothering. And it refers to a set of really widely held and deeply ingrained beliefs that we have in our society about what makes women good mothers. And in American society, good moms are children's primary caregivers. Mothers are defined as good if they put their children first, if they engage in really intensive labor to bring about positive outcomes for their kids, if they listen to experts, if they self-sacrifice for their children's well-being. And these beliefs about what makes women good mothers are very difficult to achieve. They are largely unattainable for the vast majority of moms in society, but research shows that even though they're largely out of reach, they're also widely subscribed to. A lot of moms in the US want to be intensive mothers. And in the book, I talk about how feeding children is really one of the quintessential tasks of intensive mothering. There is nothing more central to being a mom than nourishing one's children. That begins in utero with growing a human life, that continues when a baby comes, and mothers often provide milk for that child. And that just continues through kids' lives. And so, the choices that moms make about what their children eat are actually fundamentally related to how they're trying to prove to themselves and to society that they are good, loving caregivers. But what I show in the book is that the circumstances within which mothers are raising their children, whether they're bringing up their kids in contexts of poverty or affluence, fundamentally shape how exactly moms use food to show their maternal worth. Windfall child rearing is a term coined by one of my favorite sociologists, Alison Pugh, and it refers to the way that low-income parents think about spending money on their children. And this is really intimately related to how they think about spending money on food for their children. So when you are raising your child in a context of extreme financial scarcity, but also financial instability, that means that you can never count on money always being around. The low-income moms that I spent time with were not only living really close to the bone, but they were never sure how much money they were going to have on a day-to-day basis. There was always some debt collector coming by to pick up some money. There was a friend asking for money. There was rent that needed to be paid, gas that needed to be put in the car. And for these parents who were often making just about the minimum wage, that money went really fast. And so in that, situation where you're not sure if you'll have money the next day, the most rational thing to do today is to spend that money on your children, to give your children the things that they want, the things that they ask for. Because if you don't do that today, you might not be able to do that for weeks. And so I found that when low-income moms had $2-3, they would often give it to their children and let them go buy a bag of chips or a can of soda, even though they knew that was not the most nutritious choice for their child. It was something that they could give them. It was something that brought a smile to their child's faces. And it also brought to moms themselves a sense that they were good, competent caregivers, that they were the kind of caregivers who could provide for their children, even amidst extreme scarcity. And so windfall child rearing, from the outside can look like frivolous spending, like not using money wisely. But the fact of the matter is that what low-income moms know is that you can never count on money today being money tomorrow. And when one of the most important things as a mom is being able to provide for children, one of the smartest things you can do is make sure that when you do have money in your pocket, that your kids get some of what they want and what they ask for. No family that I met, from the families living in their cars to the families who are living in multi-million-dollar mansions, none of those families escaped the grasp of big food. Every single one of those families, when they stepped into the supermarket, especially with their child, were confronted with just incredible amounts of marketing of cheap, processed foods that were engineered to be delicious, that were targeted towards mothers and towards children to purchase. And so no family that I met was, was consuming a diet that was free of processed foods. And so we have this, I think, misguided assumption that these processed foods are reserved for low-income families in our society, and that wealthier families are eating, just fresh fruits and vegetables. And that's absolutely not true. And what's also not true is that it's only low-income kids who are eating junk food. All the high-income kids that I met in my study were also begging their parents for that food. Now, maybe they had learned that they should beg their parents for the Whole Foods version of that junk food. But they were still asking for chips and candy and sugar-sweetened beverages. And so those requests were something that moms across society have to navigate, have to try to balance with what they would like their children to be eating. The food industry has really marketed this idea that they're helping moms and they're helping families because they're, creating products that children like and that children will eat. But the idea that kids should get to choose what gets eaten in families is actually a pretty recent phenomenon. For years, parents decided what went on children's plates. And big food has really created this idea that we should have separate foods for adults and for children. And so when you walk into a supermarket and you see a box of sugary cereal, you can see that it's marketed to kids because there's an emphasis on how chocolatey it is. And it's also marketed to moms because it mentions how many whole grains are in there. And they're really trying to solve the issue for mothers of not having enough time, the fact that their kids want to eat certain foods. But in the book, I make the argument that a lot of this marketing just makes moms' lives harder because it is so desirable to children. Children nag their parents for it. And it puts parents, but moms in particular, in a situation where they're trying to fend off those requests, and they don't have as much agency as they would otherwise to actually choose what gets served for dinner. In our society, we have kind of shared understandings of what healthy food is and what a healthy body is and what a healthy person is. And those understandings are fundamentally shaped by our beliefs about race, ethnicity, culture. And in the book, I write about how, whole categories of food have been derogated as unhealthy, as deviant, as comfort food, in ways that are completely separate from those foods' nutritional value. And I bring up the instance of kale and collard greens because kale is really this glorified food in our society. It's like a superfood that everyone wants to eat. It's, in so many menus. They have kale chips, like there are sweatshirts that have the word kale on it. And it's no surprise that kale is a glorified vegetable, while collard greens, a vegetable that has long been associated with and prepared by the Black community within America, is nowhere near that conversation, even though kale and collard greens are pretty comparable nutritionally. Despite everything, I actually do still have a lot of hope. The way that I think we're going to work our way out of this large and complex problem is by working different angles in tandem. So I talk in the book about how, just on a really basic level, we need safety net benefits that ensure that parents are not raising their children in situations of extreme poverty. Like in this country, with all the wealth that we have, with all the opportunities that there should be, it's just completely unacceptable that some moms are raising their children in such economically dire circumstances that a bag of Cheetos is the only thing that they feel that they have to offer their child on a daily basis to bring them joy. So we need to think about, just at a baseline level, what is the minimum standard of living that any family should be in? And I would argue that the minimum standards we have now are way too low on principle, but from a nutritional angle, they're far below where they need to be, because we need to ensure that families are in a position where they have the financial stability and security to make the food choices that are actually aligned with their values, rather than having to make really difficult trade-offs in order to buffer their kids against hardship by using junk food to emotionally nourish them. But I don't think that just those kinds of policies are going to be effective. That also needs to be paired with regulation of marketing to children, with changes to the actual food system, so that processed, unhealthy, engineered foods are not the default for kids. And the places where I see hope are in schools, in places where children spend their time. I think that in this country, we don't necessarily have, at least at this moment, the political will to regulate marketing on a wide scale. But every so often, we do gather the political will to protect children. And I think about changes to the food system that protect children as absolutely central to fixing nutritional inequality. And something that happened during the pandemic that for years was considered completely politically infeasible was instituting universal school meals, ensuring that every kid in this country had access to 2 meals a day. And for years, we couldn't even talk about that. But the pandemic brought about a situation where that became possible. And I think what I try to remember is that change doesn't always happen in a linear fashion. It can happen in spurts and bits. And so from my perspective, we need to know what we're striving for. We need to be ready when those political opportunities open up for us to pass really important policies that can change the food environment for children.